Okay, let's dive right into this explainer on the world building and systemic erasure in Orisha. Usually when you pick up a massive fantasy epic like Tomi Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone, the author wants to immediately hit you with scale, right? Sprawling maps, giant battlefields, the whole shebang. But today we're going to see how this story literally flips the script. We are skipping those wide-lens fantasy tropes to focus completely on how trauma and historical gaslighting shape an entire world.
This sets things up brilliantly by hooking us through pure, stark contrast. It grounds you in something unbearably intimate, the comforting, warm, deeply human scent of jollof rice filling a small hut. It's the universal aroma of a mother's cooking. But then, bam! Before you can even settle into that warmth, it's violently ripped away, replaced by the image of that exact same mother, a woman with a crown of snow-white hair, dragged by a heavy black chain to be hanged by the orders of a ruthless monarch. It absolutely shatters that ultimate domestic comfort with the cold machinery of state terror, establishing stakes that are just visceral and deeply personal.
So, to understand all this, let's look at Section 1, History of the Maji, the Lost Magic. To really grasp the grief driving our first protagonist, Zeli, whose mother was the one executed, we have to zoom out and look at these ancient Maji clans. These people were revered as divine conduits. They maintained the balance of the whole world. You had the Eku clan, the Reapers, commanding life and death under the goddess Oya, the Omi Tiders controlling water, the Enna burners wielding fire, and the Emi connectors manipulating minds and dreams. And their snow-white hair? It wasn't just some aesthetic choice, it was a biological marker acting as a literal lightning rod for divine energy.
But here is the catch. They weren't born throwing fireballs around. The magic was a heavy physiological burden that lay entirely dormant during childhood. It only woke up when they crossed a threshold known as the Ibawai, which translates to the divine. This was a violent physical awakening that only ever happened when a Maji turned 13.
And this timeline reveals exactly how this tragic narrative was built. The official historical narrative, it claims magic just mysteriously vanished from the Maji's bloodstreams as a divine punishment from the gods. But 11 years ago, precisely when the Maji were completely powerless, King Zaran executed the Raid. He slaughtered every single adult Maji in the kingdom in one night. This is textbook state-sponsored revisionism, folks. The monarchy utilized historical gaslighting to frame a calculated political genocide as inevitable divine punishment, and that left a surviving generation to live under extreme systemic oppression.
Which brings us to Section 2, the architecture of oppression, surviving the state.
Let's explore how this historical gaslighting actually suffocates the surviving children of the Maji, known as diviners, in the present day. The state meticulously criminalizes their very existence through a self-perpetuating machine of cascading horrors. It starts with linguistic dehumanization. The royal guards and the public openly use the slur maggots, because, well, you have to make a group less than human to justify oppressing them, right? Then comes economic suffocation through arbitrary maggot rate taxes. If you default on these impossible taxes, you're sent to the stocks. And that isn't just a wooden frame in a town square, it is a legal pipeline to state-sanctioned slave labor. We're talking mining coal and building palaces until your body just gives out. To enforce this brutal system, the royal guards carry swords forged from something truly terrifying, majakasite. This is a weaponized, blackened alloy engineered before the raid. It physically burns diviner flesh on contact by chemically disrupting the latent magical iron in their blood. Think about that. The state is quite literally biologically weaponizing the diviner's own dormant genetics against them. This is the exact same metal used to forge the chain that hung Zeli's mother.
So the absolutely crucial question is, how do you even survive this? Well, in Zeli's village, an elder named Mama Agba secretly teaches the diviner girls staff combat using hollow reeds. Now, a wooden stick against a flesh-burning magicite sword sounds like a literal death sentence. Well, look at this quote. "I teach you to be warriors in the garden, so you will never be gardeners in the war." Mama Agba isn't training them to win a physical sword fight against state executioners. She is building their psychological armor. By teaching them the posture and discipline of a warrior, she's actively rewiring their brains to stand tall and maintain human dignity in a state that demands their absolute psychological submission.
But unfortunately, psychological armor doesn't pay the royal taxes. When Zeli's traumatized father is backed into a corner by rising taxes, he nearly drowns, taking a suicidal risk in the treacherous ocean just to secure one rare red-tailed sailfish to pay the extortion. But the local guards, they refuse it. They demand hard coin. This forces Zeli to make a really desperate decision. She takes her hollow reed staff and marches straight into Lion's Den, the capital city of Lagos, to sell it.
All right, let's shift gears to Section 3, Surviving the Gilded Cage, Inside the Palace. While Zeli is approaching the capital from the outside, our second protagonist, Princess Amari, is surviving a very different kind of nightmare inside the palace walls. The environmental contrast gives you absolute whiplash. We go from a sweltering reed hut smelling of sea salt and desperation to a lavish, climate-controlled tea room. And while delicate coconut pie definitely sounds vastly preferable to extortionary taxes, Amari is actually suffocating in her own gilded cage. She faces intense colorism, relentless psychological scrutiny, and judgment, especially from her own mother, who criticizes Amari's naturally darker complexion.
And this perfectly illustrates a horrifying societal behavior happening among the nobles. You see, many of these families actually carry Maji ancestry. Because King Saran has decreed Maji blood an existential crime, these terrified nobles resort to what essentially mirrors parasitic mimicry. They actively harm their own bodies, scrubbing brutal vinegar-scented lightning powders into their skin to chemically burn away their heritage and mimic King Saran's standard of purity. They are quite literally erasing themselves just to survive the political climate and avoid being eaten by the predator.
Now, for Section 4, The Return of Magic, a Shattered Reality.
Amari is forced to internalize all this self-hatred, watching adults mutilate their identities out of pure fear. But her fragile reality is entirely broken when she sneaks away from that tea room. She eavesdrops on a highly classified military briefing and learns that 2 indestructible ancient artifacts have washed ashore. The mechanics here are fascinating. They operate a lot like external batteries. They emit a concentrated divine energy that simply bypasses the severed internal tether inside diviners, violently forcing their dormant magic to wake up. So magic is not actually gone, it's just been dormant this whole time.
To empirically prove to a furious King Saran that the magic is real, a military commander forces one of these artifacts, an ancient scroll, into the hand of Amari's diviner's servant friend, a girl named Binta. Instantly, pure, undeniable light explodes into the room. A cascade of brilliant gold, shining purples, and sparkling blues erupts directly from Binta's palm. For a brief second, Amari realizes the magic, her father painted as a grotesque monster, is actually a thing of absolute, radiant beauty.
But rather than marvel at its beauty, King Saran acts instantly. In a single, fluid motion, he violently plunges his black magicite sword straight through Binta's chest simply to silence the truth. He murders a teenage girl in cold blood right on the throne room floor. Amari watches crimson flowers bloom across her best friend's dress, leaving her utterly traumatized and making her realize the true, horrifying fanaticism of her father's regime.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, A Dangerous Collision Course. King Saran genuinely believes that by executing Binta, he's put the lid back on the box, but he has actually set a massive collision course into motion. The power dynamic of the entire world is fracturing. On one side, you have the fierce villager, Zeli, marching directly toward the capital with absolutely nothing left to lose. And on the other, you have the traumatized princess, Amari, inside the capital, realizing her father's entire regime is built on lies, gaslighting, and slaughter. These 2 young women are speeding toward a violently chaotic intersection. As we wrap up this explainer on the systemic erasure and incredible world-building of Orisha, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. We've seen how trauma and powerlessness shape a society. But what happens when a brutally oppressed group, a generation treated like maggots, is suddenly handed an unparalleled, world-altering weapon? When the victims are handed the very sword that cut them down, do they break the cycle of violence, or do they inevitably become the next ruthless oppressor? Think about that as you continue exploring this deep lore on your own. Keep questioning the historical narratives around you, and I'll catch you in our next explainer.